Today's stunning guilty plea by Hugh Edwards, about Kamala Harris daring Donald Trump to debate her, or about Team GB's medals haul in Paris. On Cross Question, you steer the conversation with your questions. The panel is standing by.
On your radio, on Global Player, and
Play LBC.
Leading Britain's conversation. This is LBC.
From Global's newsroom at 8 o'clock, the Deputy Prime Minister's told LBC the government will review the list of banned groups after riots in Southport last night. Merseyside police believe people associated with the English Defence League were involved in the disorder following Monday's stabbings. But Joe Mulhall, who's an expert on far-right extremism, says banning that group won't help.
In terms of the English Defence League, it wouldn't be worth banning now in the sense that it doesn't really exist. But of course, the individuals that have been through that organisation, that have been radicalised by the anti-Muslim prejudice of Tommy Robinson, those people are still around and they're still organising and they're still engaging in really, really harmful behaviours.
The BBC's admitted it knew of Hugh Edwards' arrest over accessing indecent images of children 5 months before he resigned in April, but the corporation says it would have sacked the newsreader if he'd been charged while being a member of staff. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's vowed to continue the war despite being told to end it every single week. Iran's blaming Israel for the death of a Hamas leader. And Microsoft has revealed it's been the target of an attempted cyber attack. It says it experienced an unexpected usage spike, triggering a defence mechanism, which actually made things worse. In the city, the FTSE 100's closed up 93 points at 83.67. The pound buys $1.28 and €1.18. LBC weather: showers pushing eastwards across England and Wales tonight, turning dry in Wales by dawn, and a few lighter showers elsewhere with a low of 9 degrees. From Global's newsroom for LBC, I'm Daryl Jackson.
This is LBC. From Global, leading Britain's conversation. This is Cross Question.
Welcome back. It's a big night with lots of very meaty issues on the agenda that we can discuss here on Cross Question tonight. And we've got a fabulous panel waiting for your questions over the telephone lines at 0345 6060 973 or on text at 84850. I am joined in the studio by Rachel Cunliffe, the Associate Political Editor of the New Statesman, Chris Curtis, the Labour Member of Parliament for Milton Keynes North, Zoe Strimple, a columnist for the Sunday Telegraph, and Lord Daniel Moylan, Conservative peer, who is a former Deputy Chairman of Transport for London. You get to set the agenda for the hour that lies ahead. If you've got questions about the violence that took place in Southport last night, you can feel free to carry on talking about that. You might want to talk about a whole host of other issues that have been in the news today, including, as I was saying before the hour, at the end of the hour, that stunning guilty plea by Hugh Edwards and the questions mounting up for the BBC arising from it, or any other issues that are on your mind. And as usual, you can not only listen to us on the radio, but you can watch us because we're streaming live in video on Global Player.
Call 0345 6060 973. Tweet at LBC. Text 84850. Cross Question. Watch on Global Player. This is LBC.
And let's start with an easy question. It comes from Philip in Greenwich, who asks, does this country have a far-right problem? Lord Moylan, does the country have a far-right problem?
I don't think so, actually. And I mean, there are always a few nutcases all over the place. We have a far-left problem as well. We have a pro-Gaza problem. We have lots of people out on the street doing things we don't want to do. We don't want them to do. But I don't think we have a problem in the sense that we have real problems, like we have may get onto this later, we have a housing problem. That is a real problem that we can actually do something about. The government can do something about. But I don't think we've got a problem in that sense, no.
Chris Curtis?
Well, I mean, we should start by saying that the scenes that we've been seeing in Southport are devastating, and I can't even believe to imagine what it's like for the grieving families up there having to watch this on top of what they've already seen this happening in their local community. And we do need to call for the violence to stop. We do need to call out the actions that have happened, and we do need to support the police in clamping down on it. I mean, the scenes that we saw at the mosque yesterday were devastating. So we don't want to be seeing more of that. I mean, we should be calling out any sort of extremism in our country, whether it comes from the far right, the far left, or anybody else. And I think we should be calling out this as well. I mean, I think part of it's a far right problem. I think we've also got a problem with social media and fake news, which is one of the things that really made this explode. And I think we do need to call on social media companies to be doing more, to be ensuring that fake news is not spreading like wildfire around their platforms as it currently is. And we do need to be holding to account those who are organising a lot of these, a lot of the violence that we've seen on the streets in recent days.
Can I ask you about what the Deputy Prime Minister said on LBC earlier today? She inferred that she's thinking about the possibility of prescribing some of these far-right groups. Would you back a government move to engage in a formal ban?
Well, I mean, the Deputy Prime Minister has a lot more information available to her on that decision than I do. If she comes to the decision that that's the right thing to do, then ultimately I would back her in doing that. But I think actually the long-term solution to this is thinking about how we can be much better right across the country at bringing communities together, at ensuring that we can be more coherent, better integrated communities, avoiding that fake news spreading around on social media, avoiding the filter bubbles that we end up getting on social media that pushes people into those extreme positions in the first place. We can do prescribing organisations, but that's ultimately we need to we need to have come up with a cure, not just treat the symptoms. And I think going after solving the social media issue is going to be a big part of that.
Zoe Strimple, have we got a far-right problem in the UK?
Yeah, but there's always a far-right problem. The UK has a long history of a far-right problem, but having said that, it's not nearly as big as the far-left problem, as we've seen from, as mentioned, the pro-Hamas protests, some of which is pro-Gaza, pro-Palestine, lots of it's pro-Hamas, from Just Stop Oil, from the kind of incredibly disruptive, kind of almost messianic far-left protesting that's going on. I think the problem is that the far-right problem tends to be hugely overhyped because we do live in a caring society that's liberal. So there's a cultural agenda there that is still kind of, and for good reasons, from the sort of skinhead period and obviously the Nazis and, the mid-century. But there seems to be, it's much easier politically to say, oh, no, the problem is the far-right, when actually the far-right, the far-left, which includes people whose views come from some minority groups, is a lot harder to kind of condemn. And I would like to see prescription of the Iranian Revolutionary Guards. I think there's way more pressing groups than the far right, which, I've spoken to people in the armed, formerly quite senior in the armed forces and working on counter-terror in police as well, and they say that they are forced to kind of treat far-right terrorism as a threat on a par with anything coming out of the Muslim community, for instance, or the far left, and it's just not reality. But there's a political and cultural agenda there that makes us all pretend it is.
Rachel Cunliffe, there will be lots of people watching those scenes in Southport who say Britain does have a far-right problem.
I think it's impossible to watch those scenes and not see the problem there, because clearly a number of individuals, perhaps fueled by fake news on social media, perhaps with their own preconceptions and their own political agendas, decided to hijack a tragedy, the deaths of 3 children, to organise, and it was organised, to bus their supporters, their allies in to a grieving community.
I would say it's not just a tragedy. It was an execution and a murder. So they got it all wrong about who's responsible, but it wasn't just something that fell out of the sky. And so it's understandable that people felt there's a perpetrator and they're tired of X, Y, Z. Now it's the X, Y, Z that is the thing that we have to debate whether that's justified.
They weren't there to protest against misogyny. You could have said that the target of that attack was a Taylor Swift-themed dance class. It's very clear what demographic the perpetrator was targeting there. They weren't making a case about violence against women. They immediately pinpointed a culprit that fitted their political agenda, and they have further damaged a grieving community in order to make a political point.
But it was a migrant. Statement. It was someone from Rwanda. So of course there's nothing.
It wasn't someone from Rwanda. It was somebody who was born in the UK.
Well, and to be clear, the investigation is still underway, and it's we part of this relates to this impatience that seems to exist for the police to provide information about what actually happened.
So it also doesn't matter if people got the reasoning or some of the facts wrong about it. It's not a rational response for people in a country to bus people up to Southport in order to commit violent acts.
That is
really
serious.
Violent, extreme acts.
I agree with that.
And,
yeah.
This argument about far right, far left, we can't become a country where that is seen as a reasonable response. And we deserve to call that out. And we need to give our support to the police in cracking down on that kind of behaviour.
OK, let's broaden this conversation out and go to the telephones. Lorraine has called in from Brentwood in Essex with a question that I think follows naturally on from what we've been talking about. Lorraine, thanks for calling in.
Hi there. Yes, in view of recent events in Southport, Southend last night, the soldier that was brutally stabbed the other week, what would the panel do? Would they go with giving the police more power for stop and search? And what would the panel do to try and get rid of knife crime off of British streets?
Lord Moylan.
Right, well, I mean, that is a really difficult one. I don't think the police need more powers of stop and search, because what we're talking about here is usually solitary individuals who are setting out on what is a crazed course. I mean, even when we get to the end of the whole of this story, we know the story, we've heard the trial and the evidence, we probably still won't be able to make sense of it. Whereas the knife crime the police are better dealing with is gang-related knife crime, where they can get intelligence about gangs who are acting, they are criminal gangs, but they're acting rationally in their own terms. They know what they're doing, and the police can understand what they're doing and work things out. So they can understand also that they're running businesses as well, criminal businesses. They can understand how those businesses operate, and they can try to disrupt them in their business operations. So they're much better at dealing with knife crime where it's gang-related. Whereas here, what we're talking about in a number of instances, and this appears one of them, is some solitary individual. I said crazy. I don't know whether he's literally crazy. I don't know what his motivation was at all. But it looks crazy to me, and almost impossible to predict and catch somebody of that sort as they set out to do it. So I think there is a real problem about that. I don't think you can actually go further. I mean, we've banned handguns in this country. It's almost impossible to have any other sort of weapon except the occasional shotgun. That's one of the reasons, of course, that people use knives, is that they can't easily get hold of guns. I don't see how you can go further in banning guns. There are some knives. There are some extreme types of knives that have been banned, but essentially a kitchen knife, which you're going to have, people are going to have kitchen knives sharpened up, is always going to be available to somebody.
Mm-hmm. Rachel Cunliffe, can I ask you about the other aspect of Lorraine's question, which is what would the panel do regarding stop and search? This country's had a long, tortuous series of relationships with stop and search. Does it have a role to play here?
Well, the problem with stop and search is it relies on the police stopping and searching the right people, and their ability to do that is going to be down to a huge amount of training and community relations. And the problem with stop and search, and the reason why it was stopped or greatly reduced, was because there was a very clear racial dynamic to the people that police were choosing to stop that was making problems of community policing worse rather than better, because communities felt over-policed, and therefore the element of trust that you need for policing was really negatively impacted by that. It might make people feel safer to give the police extra powers, but actually making communities safer in practice is another matter.
Chris Curtis, stop and search?
Yeah, no, I'd sort of broadly agree with what Rachel was saying just there. I mean, it's you can spend a lot of time arguing about the very specifics of stop and search policy and what criteria you need to do the stop and search and how you avoid the racial profiling that we should be concerned about with stop and search, as much as you like. But actually, the bigger problem is that we've lost a lot of our community policing in this country. That's one of the reasons Labour wants to put extra money and resource into bringing back police officers to focus on community policing, because that's the most powerful way to clamp down on knife crime. And I've seen it in my own area, actually, where you have that community policing working well. That's the places where you don't end up getting those gangs forming. You don't end up getting... We've had a lot of knife crime in Milton Keynes in recent years. It's devastating. But actually, where community policing has worked well in the city, that's where we've avoided those problems. And we need to make sure that we're rolling that out, not just across Milton Keynes.
Well,
I was just going to say that in cases like this, I mean, it makes me think that, once again, we have the system that's supposed to look out for people's mental health and deal with mental illness. I don't mean mental health like being stressed. I mean like psychosis, bipolar, schizophrenia, any number of personality disorders. It's really tragic and terrifying how we just don't have that service. There's the social services cannot extend to proper mental health care. So there's quite a few of these are probably people who aren't in their right mind, and there's no place in the system leading up to crimes like this that can sort of either see what's going on and then treat in a way that's kind of long term. That's why, I don't know, there's a lot of homelessness on this, and you can see it's completely a problem also of mental illness, and I can't see any plans for how that's going to be fixed when the NHS can't really cope even with kind of physical trauma and problems. So to me, that's the kind of one of the major root problems.
Okay, coming up, we're going to have a question about the flip side of the coin that we've all unfortunately been watching in Southport over the last 24 hours, and that's about misinformation being spread online. You can carry on calling in with your questions at 0345 6060 973 or texting your questions to us at 84850. Stay with Cross Question on LBC.
This is LBC. Cross Question on LBC. Text 84850.
And we're back with our panel here in the studio. Rachel Cunliffe is the Associate Political Editor of the New Statesman. Chris Curtis, the Labour MP for Milton Keynes North. Zoe Strimple, columnist with the Sunday Telegraph. And Lord Daniel Moylan, a Conservative peer and former Deputy Chairman of Transport for London. We've been talking about the violence in Southport, and we have a WhatsApp question from Ed in Los Angeles, who asks, how do we tackle the scourge of fake news being spread online? And Chris, you hinted in your earlier answer that you thought that it was time for more of a crackdown. I mean, there hasn't been much of a crackdown thus far on misinformation being spread online in the UK. What does that look like?
Well, I can't sit here and write out the exact rules for how it works, but I think we have to start with the premise that social media companies need to be doing more on this, and they're often not doing enough to take down fake news as it starts to spread around their networks. I think there's another sort of related question to this as well about it affects this. It also affects, I think, another problem with social media, which is filter bubbles. The idea that basically people keep getting shown more and more things that they agree with, and fake news often spreads around because it connects with a certain type of people. It can spread around their networks like wildfire. And I think actually a bigger conversation we need to have as a country is whether we want to change the way or think a lot more about the way that algorithms on a lot of these social media networks work, so they are not just showing people things that they agree with and pushing them more and more into a certain position, so they are not allowing things like this to spread around their networks so quickly without the truth being able to get about. And I think we should now start to have conversations about social media companies' responsibility not to be maximising the number of clicks that they get on the post, which is what these algorithms are designed to do, but actually ensuring that people are getting a broad range of views, opinions, and more importantly, they're getting the truth pumped into their news feeds and corrections as well.
Lord Moylan, I was making the point in the last hour that we sitting behind these microphones tonight cannot say anything we want. There are regulators keeping an eye on all broadcasters, and yet the minute we leave this studio, we can all fire up our social media accounts and say whatever we want. Shouldn't something be done to address that?
Well, you aren't very up to date. I spent too much of my life last year working on the Online Safety Bill, now the Online Safety Act, which is there, I think, quite pointlessly in many cases, to try and regulate this sort of thing. And there is indeed a regulator. It is Ofcom, the same regulator who regulates you. Brilliant, Ofcom. We have entrusted supervision of the internet to Ofcom. It's all going to be absolutely fine. And they're preparing for it, and they're working it up, and it's all simply brilliant. Except it won't be brilliant, because the fundamental problem is that there is a big difference between fake news, that is the statement of false facts, and unacceptable opinions, or opinions people don't like. And you want to filter out fake news. That's one thing. I can see social media companies doing that, but you stray very rapidly into political censorship of saying that people can't say these things because it's unacceptable. And the political bias we've seen from the big American-based, California-based companies has always been against the conservative, the more right-wing opinions, and more tolerant of crazed and unacceptable left-wing opinions. Can I say one other thing? I think the police have got to stop being so mealy-mouthed. There are a lot of people who don't actually believe the police are telling the truth about incidents like this. So they just need to think a bit more carefully about their language. When they said this guy originated in, did it say Cardiff or Swansea? I can't remember. Cardiff. When they said this guy originated in Cardiff, I took that as meaning he was born in Cardiff, but it's perfectly clear an awful lot of people didn't. They thought that was some sort of, well, did he move from Cardiff? Where did he come from originally? Why couldn't they have said right at the outset, in straightforward, plain English, this guy was born in Cardiff? It took them the best part of 24 hours to get round to saying that. So I think they just need to be clear. Where his parents came from Rwanda. They said it eventually, but they come up with this mealy-mouthed stuff that seems designed to hide things, and it feeds irrational suspicions.
Rachel?
Various countries, the UK obviously included with the online safety bill, are attempting to solve this problem of regulating the internet to answer the question of, are social media sites, platforms, are they publishers? How do you regulate something that is so international when you've got speech that it's originating in another country, another jurisdiction? The EU's looking at it, even Congress in the US is looking at it. And if there were an easy answer, I think we would have found it by now. I think we're going to have to there's been a lot of trial and error when it comes to how we solve this problem. But I think before we get to that solution, we need to look at it from the way that people engage in it. And that means education, which sounds like a sort of easy get-out clause off. We just educated people out of it. But you can teach children in schools what the internet is, how it works, the incentives at play on these platforms, the fact that the content that you see the most is going to be monetized. People are literally making money out of writing the most provocative things that gets shared widely. That's an industry, that's a business. And I've spoken to academics looking into the way disinformation spreads and into extremism and counter-extremism. And one of the things they say is that if you can expose children and young people early to what they're going to see on the internet and explain to them what's going on, you have a much better chance of raising adults who are much more critical and who will still see this content because you can't stop it, but who when they see it will go, hang on, is this a reputable source? What does this person want me to think? And why? And I think we've got to put more emphasis there, because I think just finding a way to make sure it doesn't turn up in our feeds, it'd be great if we could do that, but I just struggle to see how that's going to happen.
Zoe Strimple, is the misinformation genie out of the bottle?
Well, I mean, I think some of the problems with putting it back in the bottle have been said. So, yes, I mean, it clearly is. I think to follow on from this idea of the murkiness of trying to do this, to put it back in the bottle, that you quite soon slide into, is it opinion that we don't like and censorship? But I would just like to say, on a more everyday level, and it's a legally murky level perhaps, but I mean, we just look at how political even what is kind of received news is. I mean, the BBC has gotten in quite a lot of trouble over the way it's reported certain events in Gaza, actually. It's to do with bombings of hospitals, whatever, and they immediately just kind of repeat what the so-called Hamas health ministry have said, and then they later, much later, are forced to kind of make a correction. But by then, false news has been put out into the ether by one of the most respected broadcasters in the world. And so this becomes a political issue. Why are they choosing to repeat verbatim those things? And that is often to do with a political agenda. So we're seeing it, the Washington Post, New York. It's an old, the different media outlets that are regulated and are mainstream all have agendas, and that all inflects the way they report. So again, that's just yet another slippery slope. I also want to just say that I think, the free marketeer in me, not entirely free, obviously, but free-ish, would like to see a sort of degree of competition making this less of an issue over time. So, is there a way to have, at the moment it's quite punitive to access really quality news because there's obviously the license fee, but it's expensive to get behind paywalls now. There's hardly anything left unpaywalled. So, could there be new innovations so that more people can quickly get their news fix for free or for in different sort of with different funding structures? I don't know. So I think that's a more natural way of solving the problem. Chris
Curtis, I think you were trying to get in there.
Well, no, I suppose I agree with the problem that you've made about trying to draw a line between where is and isn't fake news is a problem, and it's why education is ultimately also part of the solution. But just trying to widen this debate out to one about the problems that are caused by the algorithms, I think is true, because we are never going to be able to come up with good rules that work perfectly on what is and isn't true, and that's only to be honest with you, most of the time that's only a small part of the problem anyway. This actual full-on fake news. The much bigger problem is that increasingly in this country, people are being pushed into a space where they are only seeing things that they're very likely to agree with to start off with, and are really sort of touching their emotion, pushing their emotional buttons. And that's a really dangerous place for us to get to. Now, I don't have the solution, and obviously I don't think us politicians should really be starting to interfere in that. But I do think that we need to have a big conversation about those problems that are being created by these algorithms that social media networks use. It is not impossible for them to start using, still using algorithms, but ones that are doing the opposite of that and pushing a range of opinion, a diversity of opinions onto people. But at the moment, they do not feel that there is a financial incentive for them to do so. And I don't know how you get the free market into a position where they feel like there is an incentive for them to do so, but we need to, because it's a really dangerous path that we're heading down, I think, if that continues.
And Lord Moylan, can I just pick up on what you were saying earlier about, the police need to stop being mealy-mouthed, I think.
Yeah, and they need plain language.
There seems to be an extraordinary amount of pressure, for, I suppose, understandable reasons, on the police investigating the attack in Southport, almost to keep up with this welter of misinformation on social media. But institutionally, the police have procedures that govern criminal investigations, and there must be a degree to which they are nervous that by being forced into constantly updating public statements, they put those investigations at risk.
I'm not asking them to put their investigations at risk. I'm not asking them to say anything. I'm asking them, when they do say something, to say it in plain English, exactly what they mean, they know the sensitivity of this, and not do it as if they were filling in some sort of form written by a bureaucrat. Who says, does anybody around this table say, I originated in Birmingham or Milton Keynes or whatever? You say, I was born there. That's English. That word originated caused a lot of problems, in my view, because it sounded as though they were trying to hide something. They weren't, but they talk like bureaucrats, just plain English messages. So I'm not saying they should say anything they wouldn't say otherwise. I'm saying how they should say it, because how they say it is not trusted by a lot of these people who are driven, to this sort of activity. And a great penumbra of people who are not driven to this activity but have sympathy with them.
Rachel Cunliffe?
I understand the point that you're making, and I probably wouldn't have used the word originated if I were in that situation, but I don't think that's at the heart of the issue. I think at the heart of the issue is that there were people who were determined, who saw this tragedy and were determined to turn it to their political ends and to sow doubt about the official reports, and they were the kind of people who had followings of supporters who wanted to believe them. So I think even if the police had used clearer language, you would still have seen the eruption of violence that we saw last night. I don't think that's at the heart of what drove some people to decide that they wanted to bust rioters into a grieving community.
And just a reminder that we are keeping an eye, very close eye.
It would make it very strange turning up at a mosque, though, wouldn't it? You would, even if you were the sort of person who was thick and dangerous enough to get on a bus to go to another part of the country in order to riot, you would still, just possibly, when you got there, say, why are we outside a mosque?
Well, we will be keeping an eye on Southport throughout the night. Obviously, a nervous evening there, and we will be coming back with more of your questions for the panel on this edition of Cross Question. 0345 6060 973 is the number, and you can text us at 84850. It is just after 8:30 now, and the news headlines come from Daryl Jackson.
Police in Merseyside have called in extra support from forces across the region to avoid a second night of disorder in Southport. Dozens of officers were injured when bricks, stones and bottles were thrown and cars were set alight during the unrest. It's emerged the BBC knew of Hugh Edwards' arrest 5 months before they ended his contract. Earlier, he pleaded guilty to accessing indecent images of children. And a man's been arrested on suspicion of murder following the death of a mother of 6 in Suffolk. Anita Rose was found unconscious with head and facial injuries after taking her dog for a walk in Brantham a week ago. LBC weather: showers pushing eastwards across England and Wales tonight, turning dry in Wales by dawn with a few lighter showers elsewhere and a low of 9 degrees.
This is LBC. Cross Question on LBC.
And we're back with Rachel Cunliffe, Associate Political Editor of the New Statesman, Chris Curtis, Labour MP for Milton Keynes North, Zoe Strimple, columnist for the Sunday Telegraph, and Lord Daniel Moylan, the Conservative peer. And joining us now with his question on Cross Question is Michael from Sunderland. Michael, what's your question for the panel?
Yeah, good evening. Thanks for giving us this opportunity to ask the panel this question. What type of message are the courts sending out when they sentence a convicted paedophile to only 12 months suspended sentence when he sent over 300 images to Hugh Edwards, 41 of them of children?
And this question from Michael refers to 25-year-old convicted paedophile Alex Williams, who has been revealed to be the man who sent the 41 abusive images of children to Hugh Edwards. He pleaded guilty to possessing and distributing abusive images of children back in March and received a 12-month suspended sentence. Zoe Strimple, what kind of message does that send out?
I was hoping you wouldn't start with me on this. Well, look, I don't think there's any message coming out into society that it's in any way a minor thing to do something like this. Firstly, most people know that it's one of the most perverse things anyone can do. I think my understanding is that it depends. So if there's some it's a complicated set of crimes within this, and if you, I don't know, if people are caught actually filming images or abusing children, I gather that has a longer and more punitive sentence to disseminating images and all that sort of thing. I think I don't think the message can possibly be anything other than this is one of the worst things you can do. We do also obviously have a huge prison overcrowding issue. So I don't know what would happen if you suddenly put lots of pedophiles in prison for ages. There could be other calculations like that. I think there's also an element of the desire to rehabilitate with convicted paedophiles like this. So that's also part of the equation. I mean, I would argue that actually the sentencing is way too short for things like violent crime, murder, things like that. So we are looking at a country who generally is a bit short on sentences with overpacked prisons.
Chris Curtis, I think that Michael in Sunderland is indicating that he thinks the sentence was far too short.
This is not a case I have in any way been close to following. It's not something that I know any of the detail. I'm sorry to say I know any of the details about, and I don't think it would be reasonable for me to comment on something that I just haven't been following and don't know about. I'm sorry for not being able to give you a better answer there, Darryl.
Lord Moylan?
Yeah, from time to time I get asked questions about individual sentences like this, and I always give the same answer. There's somebody there in the court who has heard all the evidence on both sides. That's the judge. And they've made a decision about what the sentence is, admittedly in line with sentencing guidelines that are given to them. They don't just pluck the sentences out of the air. They've heard all the evidence in this particular case, and I haven't. So I generally don't think it's my job to go around criticising judges and magistrates or whoever it is for the sentence they give. I don't do it.
Rachel Cunliffe, is there a message in this or not?
We don't know the reasoning behind the suspended sentence, but one thing that we have seen in courtrooms recently over the last year is suspended sentences being given because of the overcrowding crisis in our prisons, and the fact that we have run out of prison places, and that has meant that there aren't the available places for us to put away dangerous people. Again, I don't know the details of this case, but I was reading the details of a different case, a man who stabbed a woman in the stomach when she refused to have sex with him, who was also given a suspended sentence specifically because there wasn't a place in prison available for him. And I think that needs to be part of the conversation we have when the new prisons minister talks about letting people out of prison early. There was a huge amount of outrage about that decision, but it needs to be seen in the context of there are not enough places. And so if you let people out early, you can at least free up some places for people who really do deserve to be there. But fundamentally, we need to be building more prisons. We need a justice system that looks at rehabilitation and punishment together and looks at the state of the prison service rather than just sort of assuming, well, there will be a space available when we need it, because we clearly are seeing that those spaces aren't, and it is leading to, again, I don't know the details of this case, but it is leading to some sentences that do on the face of it look absurd.
Can I just say, part of the context is sentences have got longer and longer.
We haven't built the prisons to keep up.
I'm making a different point. Sentences have got longer and longer for the same offence. So sentences that would, we're getting 30-year sentences routinely now, whereas 20 years ago, similar crimes would have led to a sentence with a tariff of 13, 14, 15 years. So we're sort of doubling sentences, and then we're wondering why there's no space in prisons. Well, what are we achieving by these longer sentences? We're not achieving anything, in my view, by these longer and longer and longer sentences. And we're going to end up like America, where they routinely give out sentences of 150 years, whatever that means. I don't even know what it means to be given a sentence of 100. Nobody serves 150 years. What does it mean? That's where we're going to end up. And we would really think, what is the point of these very, very long sentences?
OK, let's change topics and move in a different direction, because we have a WhatsApp question from Caroline, who says, while the government is talking about building all the new homes and even new towns, why is no one addressing all the off-plan overseas buyers? So many new build flats are left empty because the owner lives in another country. Chris?
There are lots of things that are wrong with our housing market, and I think, part of what's wrong with our housing market is that house prices go up so quickly that people see it as investment vehicles rather than what they should be seen as a roof over their heads. But to be honest with you, it doesn't matter what your view is on the problem facing the reason we're in the mess we're in with the housing market. The solution is always the same, and that's that we just have not been building enough houses as a country, and the solution is therefore pretty damn simple. We need to start making sure that we're building more houses again.
But I think what Caroline is getting at is that what's the point in building new houses if you're then going to allow overseas buyers who don't plan to occupy them or use them to buy them?
I don't think that this is actually as big a problem as it's often made out in the housing market. But one of the problems, the only reason that you'd possibly be buying a house in the UK to leave it empty is because you don't need to put anyone in it, because you know that house is going to continue to go up in value, and it's an investment. That's the ridiculousness of the situation. House prices in the UK have been consistently going up much quicker than wages in the UK. We need to change that. We need to flip that around. We need wages to be going up quicker than house prices, so that people from my generation who have not been able to get on the housing ladder can start to get on the housing ladder again. The only way that we can do that, it's a free market economy. There is supply and demand that exists. The only way that you can do that is to be starting to build the new genuinely affordable houses that Britain needs in the UK. And I'm so happy to be part of a government that is genuinely taking this issue seriously.
Zoe Strimple, any worries from your laissez-faire perspective about foreign buyers?
Frankly, not really. I think that actually this point is really right, that if we make other assets more attractive, then actually that could sort of solve the problem in itself. But the reason I don't have too many worries is because I think it's lumping together two ends of a market which actually aren't that closely related. I think we all know that the types of foreign buyers that we're talking about are the ones that are incredibly rich. They're not buying new builds for first-time buyers. And there can be all kinds of schemes. You can put in place things if you want to kind of artificially restrict the market. But I don't think it's a God-given right either to just have like a nice, everything. If there's breakages within the market, which I think there are in relation to state spending and state everything, then those need to be fixed. But I really think, I don't think that building new houses paid for, I don't know exactly how, is going to affect the types of buyers that the caller was worrying about.
Lord Moylan, thoughts about overseas buyers?
Yeah, very quickly. The majority of overseas buyers, in my experience, and I know London best, are buying to let out. And in that sense, they're not obstructing supply. The flat, if it's a flat, is still available to somebody living here to rent it. Doesn't matter what the colour of the skin of the person, of the landlord is particularly. There are some, of course, who are just buying and leaving empty because they're hugely rich, or they only turn up once a week a year. That is a bit more of a problem, but it's very, very, very small numbers. I agree with Chris about that, and it is a different market. I will say something else, which sounds a bit odd. Every time a foreign buyer buys a new property in London, that is, in terms of the national accounts, that is effectively an export. And we are exporting that flat.
In what sense? Because literally, in terms of the way it's recorded.
Yeah, that's right, because we are selling that flat. They're buying something that we've made. It just happens to stay here after we've made it. And this partly arises from the fact that we run a persistent trade deficit. So in a sense, when those flats are sold, they're paying for our iPhones. And we've got to realise that we are, unless we actually do something about our trade deficit, we're going to carry on doing this. Countries that have huge surpluses on their trade account, like Abu Dhabi, do not sell flats to foreigners. I mean, I know Dubai does because they haven't got any oil, but Abu Dhabi next door doesn't sell flats to foreigners, doesn't need to, because it has a huge trade surplus. We have persistent trade deficit, which nobody wants to talk about, but that needs addressing, and this is part of the consequence of it.
Rachel Cunliffe.
I agree that it's very, it can be very unsettling when you're wandering through London and you see these luxury tower blocks and there are no lights on anywhere, and you wonder about that real estate and the people who have bought it and aren't living in it. But I agree that it's really important to recognise that it is a very different part of the market from first-time buyers trying to get a family home or their first flat. And I can understand the instinctive reaction that something has gone wrong when something that should be a home is being used as an investment. But I think too often the focus of that conversation moves the wider conversation away from where it should be, which is there aren't enough houses, we're not building enough houses, and there's too much focus on are the houses going to the right people and not enough focus on are we building enough and why aren't we building enough.
I'm just so passionate about this because I just find it so frustrating, the number of people who too often just try to find reasons why we shouldn't build the houses that we need. I say this as someone, there's many of us who have just been elected who come from a generation who have really faced the consequences of the housing crisis in the country, whether this is rogue landlords we've had to deal with, not being able to get on the housing ladder, having to live with mum and dad for too long. But I also say this as the first MP who was born and grew up in Milton Keynes, a new town that was built by a Labour government government in the 1960s and 1970s that pushed past this opposition in order to build somewhere fantastic that gave me a brilliant start in life. I would not have been elected to Parliament and had the great start in life that I'd had if they hadn't pushed through that opposition to mean that my young parents could bring me up in a fantastic house that they managed to own and get on the housing ladder, a place with good public services, with infrastructure and an economy that worked. And too much in recent decades, we have been a country that tries to find reasons not to build the things that we need, and we cannot continue down that road. And I'm determined to make sure that I do everything that I can in Parliament to get this country building again.
OK, more of your questions ahead on Cross Question. When we come back, we're going to talk about Donald Trump. It's 8:45.
LBC. Cross Question on LBC. Call 0345 6060 973.
And Joe in Brighton has a question about Donald Trump. Joe?
Hi, it's kind of multifaceted. It's an honour to speak to you. Oh gosh, what's your name again?
Simon. It's nice to talk to you too, Joe.
You're one of the people who makes my Fridays special.
Well, thank you very much. American Week, 10 to 6, although there won't be one this Friday. But let's crack on. What would you like to ask about Donald Trump?
I've got two multifaceted questions and also a solution to all those other issues you spoke about earlier on. Right. Do you believe that Donald Trump's campaign is unraveling? Because obviously, the Conservative Party go every year to the RNC to learn tactics to use over there. They tried those tactics in this election, and now it's unraveling for Donald Trump. All the things he tried first time is not working this time. Do you think that's why the Kamala Harris is now gaining, that the fear tactics have failed?
Well, Joe, I'm going to deliberately avoid answering your question because this is about the panel tonight, not about me, but maybe I'll come back at the end. Lord Moylan, are we seeing the unravelling of Trump? Within the last hour, he's been doing a question and answer session at the National Association of Black Journalists conference, and he has slammed the moderator as rude. He's claimed people asking questions of him work for fake news networks, and has said that Kamala Harris was always of Indian heritage and she was only promoting Indian heritage. He goes on to ask, is she Indian or is he black? All of this coming at a time when polls show Harris gaining ground on Trump in 6 of the 7 swing states.
Yeah, I don't know whether his campaign is unravelling. I think it's probably true to say that he'd got a campaign that was organised around fighting Biden. That was understandable. Biden was the candidate that he was up against, and he's probably finding it a bit difficult to adjust to fighting a different candidate, but I don't know whether he's unravelling. I mean, he seems to me to call anybody who challenges him rude. It's a word he uses a great deal. It's the new. What was the last thing you said? It seemed a new one on there. I don't know about Kamala. I mean, one of her parents was Indian origin, the other was from Jamaica,
correct,
as I understand. And I don't know what he's getting at there. But yeah, he's always saying people work for fake news organisations. They spend his whole time in office calling most of the mainstream media fake news. So is that a sign of unravelling? I don't know.
Chris Curtis, is he unravelling in the face of Kamala Harris?
This is a matter for the US voters to decide which president they end up wanting, and we will work with whoever ends up getting elected.
That's very interesting, because I did notice
what is the best interests of the UK.
I did notice in Milwaukee that Dame Karen Pierce, the British ambassador, was there trying to build bridges with people in Trump world, perhaps anticipating an outcome that certainly Joe in Brighton thinks may not occur. Zoe Strample.
Well, I don't really know what unravelling can mean in the context of anything to do with Donald Trump, and that is a genuine comment. So, yes, no, it doesn't. I'd be very surprised if this marked the actual final countdown, meltdown that sane people would hope for. But the interesting question is the Kamala effect, and this sort of slight sense that now he's up against someone who's not just Joe Biden, but she's actually suddenly starting to have a better campaign than people predicted. But I still think just because people have changed their tune on Kamala, she was incredibly unpopular before. She has a real problem with word saladism and incoherence. Her slipperiness or whatever that made people despise her. So we'll see how far she can go by being kind of well presented and not outrageous. But it wouldn't surprise me if in the end this Trump just ended up getting the upper hand still.
Is this the great unravelling, Rachel Cunliffe?
Well, I remember 2016 where Donald Trump was up against Hillary Clinton, who was incredibly polished, and it did seem on a daily basis during that campaign that Trump was unravelling, and then he surprised everyone by winning. So I don't think you can necessarily use evidence of unravelling as a sign that he won't still win the White House. We just don't know. There are too many unknowns when it comes to Trump voters. But one thing that we did see with Trump when he was president and since is that when he feels under attack and when he's on the defensive, he gets erratic, he gets nasty, and he gets vicious. We know that independent voters are going to be crucial to this election, and a number of voters who might have considered themselves Republican in the past, who aren't sure they can stomach another Trump presidency, the more vicious and erratic he is seen to be, perhaps that will solidify things in those voters' minds. Certainly things have taken a turn for the worse for the Trump campaign since Joe Biden announced that he was not going to be the nominee, and it looks increasingly like it's certain that it's going to be Kamala Harris. And there is energy around her campaign, the amounts that she's been able to raise and the excitement surrounding her. That is a change in tone. That is sort of fresh momentum to the Democratic campaign. But Trump voters are Trump voters, and we can't predict anything.
And Joe, putting my LBC Washington correspondent hat back on, I will say simply that I'm not sure he's entirely unravelling, but I think he's been poleaxed by the arrival of Kamala Harris on the scene, and I don't think he's found his mojo yet successfully for launching broadsides against her. And I suspect that's something that we've witnessed today at this appearance that the former president has been making. But it's a long way to November. Thanks very much indeed for that question. Let's go now to Hassan, who is calling from Kensington. Hassan, what's your question for the panel?
My question is about Israel assassinating the political leader of Hamas. When you assassinate the person that you're supposed to negotiate with to get your hostages released, does that show you that you're not really interested in negotiations anymore?
It's a fascinating question, Hassan. It's one we're going to be talking about in the next hour of the programme as well. This, of course, relates to the killing today of Ismail Haniyeh, a senior figure within Hamas. He was actually assassinated on Iranian soil as he was attending the inauguration of the new Iranian president. Zoe Strimple, is this an effort, do you think, by Israel to undercut the process of negotiation in which Haniyeh was involved?
I mean, Israel, I think what gets lost in the way things are covered here is how passionately Israel wants those hostages back. So that's the first thing to say. They will do what they think is necessary for doing that, but they are also facing an incredibly well-organized terrorist army. So all this talk of negotiating, I don't think people really understand what they are asking Israel to negotiate with. And I think it's actually incredible how much they have done. Time and again, every time they get close to it, there's an incredibly nasty sting in the tail, a kind of complete lack of good faith, obviously, from the terrorists that they're dealing with. So I think it's complicated. I think they are working along a twin line of being open to a negotiation working, but then immediately assessing that it won't work, and so then continuing along a military line. Obviously, there's a couple of things brewing over there, partly from Hamas, partly from Iran. But I think Israel's agenda has been very clear from the start and completely understandable and completely the same as any other country would have, which is that it needs to completely annihilate the political and military infrastructure of Hamas. They have made no secret of the fact they will do it again and again and again, et cetera, et cetera. All that tends to get lost amid false cries of genocide. I think then there's a separate thing going on about Netanyahu, who is politically, a dead duck and very unpopular. But it's not clear to me that it's Netanyahu's, very unappealing, slightly worrying obsession with power that is also behind what people are calling sort of escalatory behaviour. It's not at all clear to me that any leader in that position wouldn't be doing the same thing.
Lord Moylan, the question really, though, is about whether it's a good way to conduct negotiations by assassinating the leader of the negotiating team of the other side.
Well, it certainly makes a point.
But my point is that it's not negotiations.
Right.
It's a war dealing with, as the Israelis say, the sons of Satan. Mm-hmm. So it's not actually accurate or fair to depict it as some sort of normal negotiation where Israel has sort of massively jumped out of the norms of civilization and gone into a bloodthirsty rage. That's not what's going on.
I think the main thing is Israel is sending a message. If you are a leader of Hamas and we can get you, we're going to get you. Do not imagine you're going to have a nice, comfortable life living in wherever this guy was living. I don't know, some of them are in
Qatar,
different Gulf states, Qatar or whatever. And you can, go off to a jolly in Tehran as the representative of your alleged state or whatever it is you think you're representing. And we won't get you. We will get you if we can. And I think that's the point they're making. Ordinary people in Gaza are suffering. Why should you have a comfortable life flitting about on a plane when you're one of the people behind it? I think that's the point they're making.
Rachel Cunliffe?
And I sympathise with it, actually.
I will defer to Zoe, who knows a lot more about Israeli politics than I do. I will just say that the coverage of this I have found slightly strange, the way this individual is being discussed as a peace negotiator when he was one of the leaders of a terrorist organisation and the mastermind behind the October 7th attack that killed 12,000 people, most of them civilians. And I think framing it 1,200. But I think reframing it as he's been pushing for peace. He's been the chief negotiator in this. Without that context, is somewhat disingenuous.
And again, we're going to talk about this after the hour because I actually met him and interviewed him several years ago, and we'll talk about that coming up after the news. But Chris Curtis, what's your view on what's taken place over the last few hours?
I'm not going to mourn his death particularly, but there's just to widen it out. What we've been seeing in Israel-Gaza is devastating. We need to reach a point of peace as quickly as we possibly can. But I think given the events of the last 48 hours or so, we also need to be working and encouraging everybody in the region to stop this escalating further, because the impacts of that would be catastrophic.
OK, with a screech of tyres, we're going to move to the fun question of the night to round things out. And it comes from Kelly in Swansea. After the star of reality show First Dates, Fred Siriex, emotionally watched his daughter Andrea pick up an Olympic bronze for Team GB at diving, what has a member of your family done which has made you extremely proud? Chris.
Well, tomorrow, my grandmother, who has lived in Milton Keynes all of her life, for most of it hasn't been Milton Keynes, turns 92, which I think is a pretty damn good achievement. So happy birthday for tomorrow, and I'm damn proud of you.
Happy birthday to her, absolutely. Zoe Strimple.
Once on a propeller plane, my mother, it hadn't taken off yet, waved down one of the flight attendants or whoever was there, staff, and said, excuse me, are you aware, does the pilot know that one of the propellers isn't on yet? And this episode taught me to, like, no matter how stupid or obvious you think a question is, you could still ask it.
It was a problem that the propeller was not on?
Well, the plane was supposed to take off, but they knew it wasn't on. But she thought she would just check
Pointed
in
out.
case that, because you never know.
Absolutely, you never do.
Yeah.
Rachel Cunliffe.
My father is 71. He is retired and he is still mountaineering, climbing actual mountains in Switzerland, the kind where you camp in a little hut the night before and then go off with your ice axes and your crampons. And it absolutely terrifies me. And I tell him every time, please be careful. Are you sure you want to be doing this? But he's still doing it, and that makes me incredibly proud.
Good for you. Good for him, Lord Moylan.
Well, I can beat all of those. I mean, as I feel my age creeping up on me, like Chris I remember May's Chris, who is so young, brought up his elderly grandmother, and happy birthday to her, by the way. But I feel my age, and I admire those of my relatives who've made it into their 90s. But I can beat you in that I have one great grandfather who made it to 112, and I think 112, and that is exactly what I intend to do as well. And I intend to spend all of those years in the House of Lords, whether Keir Starmer, because he is not going to succeed in turfing the oldies out, this war on old people that the Labour Party is conducting, taking away their winter fuel allowances, kicking them out of the House of Lords. It is not going to succeed. We will resist it.
A pledge from Lord Moylan to round off this edition of Cross Question. My thanks to Rachel Cunliffe, Associate Political Editor of the New Statesman, Chris Curtis, Labour MP for Milton Keynes North, Zoe Strimple, columnist for the Sunday Telegraph, and Lord Daniel Moylan, who is going nowhere. That is all for Cross Question for the summer. Cross Question will return on Monday, the 2nd of September. Put a date in your diary. In the next hour, we're going to maintain our glance at what's taking place overseas in the Middle East. I want to know if you think it is now inevitable that the crisis is about to spiral out of control. The war is war between Israel and Iran, or Israel and Hezbollah, now inevitable after Israel killed Ismail Haniyeh of Hamas on Iranian soil. A stunningly pugnacious move, taking out a Hamas leader while he was in Tehran attending the new Iranian president's inauguration. I once met the man the Israelis killed today. I'll tell you about that and suggest to you that in an earlier era, it just may have been possible to negotiate him. Was an opportunity lost long before October the 7th.
On your radio, on Global Player, and
Play LBC.
leading Britain's conversation. This is LBC.
From Global's newsroom, the Deputy Prime Minister has told LBC the government will take on the thugs involved in last night's disorder in Southport. 4 people have now been arrested after the violence